Today I'm going to talk about the Blade Runner series, especially Blade Runner 2049 and Nabokov's Pale Fire, and how they deal with themes of Ascension. What the hell do I mean by Ascension? Well, if you've ever seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know that at the very tippy top of that pyramid, there is a need called self-actualization. Self-actualization could be a whole other video, but part of what it is building something that outlasts you. Erik Erikson, a pioneer of developmental psychology, came up with a theory of human development from birth to death. He said that the very last stage, from age 65 to death, dealt with the conflict of ego integrity versus despair. Did we build something bigger than ourselves? Did we serve something bigger than ourselves? Or do we despair because everything we are and everything we care about passes from this earth when we do? Blade Runner 2049 is the sequel to the 1982 Ridley Scott movie Blade Runner. The newer one was directed by Dennis Villeneuve, who directed the new Dune adaptation. Both are cyberpunk noir dystopias. In them, manufactured humanoid biological machines, known as replicants, are used as slave labor. Some rebel and run away, hiding as normal human beings in the grimy neon underbelly of a future LA. Certain members of the police force, known as Blade Runners, hunt down and capture escaped replicants. In the first Blade Runner, depending on the cut you watch, it's heavily implied that Deckard, the titular LAPD Blade Runner, is himself a replicant. He goes from hunting replicants to running off with one, his love interest Rachel. In the sequel, Ryan Gosling's character Kay, also an LAPD Blade Runner, is confirmed to be a replicant within the first 10 minutes. He hunts down a renegade older model of replicant who is hiding out as a farmer. They have an exchange.
I don't retire my own kind because we don't run. Only older models do.
And you new models are happy scraping the shit. Because you've never seen a miracle.
Kay returns home having done his duty. The first movie has suspected replicants taking something called the Voight-Kampff test. It's a test of normal emotional responses to questions about upsetting scenarios. Micro-expressions, sweat response, pupil dilation, and most important, a lack of empathy are all the giveaways for a replicant on the run. In 2049, after killing the farmer, Kay takes a test that requires the opposite from him. It determines whether he is bothered by his job murdering other replicants.
Recite your baseline.
Blood black nothingness began to spin. A system of cells interlinked within cells, interlinked within cells, interlinked within one stem, and dreadfully distinct against the dark, a tall white fountain plate.
Cells.
Cells.
Have you ever been in an institution? Cells.
Cells.
Do they keep you in a cell? Cells.
Cells.
It's an excerpt of the poem from Nabokov's Pale Fire. This scene is the theme and tone setter for the film. In screenwriting terms, its opening image. The interrogation is claustrophobic, disorienting, dehumanizing. I found its recitation so striking, I immediately went and got Pale Fire and read it over the next couple of days. This scene, a standout in an incredible film, developed fairly late in the production. The original plan was to have Ryan Gosling lying down on a table, like in a medical procedure, and recite a poem. Gosling himself suggested Pale Fire and lifting the aggressive call and response from an acting exercise. It is a cardinal sin of movie making to remind your audience that there is a better piece of media they could be consuming instead, which is why it's kind of a ballsy move for Blade Runner 2049 to name-check Pale Fire, which is arguably the best novel of the 20th century. But spoilers for this video, it works. Blade Runner 2049 ends up being a better movie when read intertextually with Pale Fire. We will come back to Pale Fire. Kay discovers that the replicant he killed had buried a dead replicant on the farm where he'd been hiding, a female who died in childbirth. We, the audience, discover this is Rachel from the first movie. Kay's boss is alarmed because this information, that a replicant could have a child, would upset the political balance of the world, which is built on the slave labor of manufactured replicants. She orders Kay to find and kill the now adult child, a naturally born replicant. The Wallace Corporation, the current manufacturers of replicants, find out about the rediscovery of a replicant capable of bearing children. They want to rediscover the technology for self-reproducing replicants to create generations of self-propagating slaves. From then on, the movie is a race. Kay versus the Wallace Corporation to find the child. Meanwhile, Joe begins to struggle. Privately, he has nurtured some small sense of personal identity. He has a budding romantic relationship with his Siri-like virtual home assistant, Joy, that makes little sense if he didn't have feelings or needs. But the existence of a naturally born replicant changes his own perception of what a replicant is. More than that, in his investigation, he discovered that the mother, Rachel's death date, matches a date he remembers. The first half of the film is him hunting down clues to determine whether he's the child. He finds a toy he recalls owning, etched with the date, but still he's suspicious. As part of their manufacturing process, replicants are implanted with memories about their lives and childhood to make them social and subservient. So this might be someone else's memory. So he goes to one of the subcontractors who creates memories for replicants to investigate the veracity of his own memory. She tells him it's illegal to implant real memories into a replicant. And then, upon viewing his memory of the toy for him, a memory of himself as an orphan being chased and beaten by other children who want the toy, she confirms the memory is real. So here's Kay, who previously couldn't imagine running, who barely had feelings, having a crisis. His holographic girlfriend, Joy, says he's a person with a birthday and memories, and christens him Joe, which he resists at first and then adopts. He withholds from his boss the information about his birth date, but after confirming the memory is real, he takes the baseline test again. He fails. He lies about having found and killed the child, and that buys him a day or two before he's killed. Joe now has to run. He finds Deckard from the first movie, the father of the child, to learn something about his own background. Why was he abandoned? Deckard is in hiding to make it as hard as possible to find the child. But Joe has accidentally led the Wallace Corporation to Deckard. They take him, and in the fight, Joy, Joe's love interest, is broken and gone forever. Let's talk about Pale Fire. And then it happened. The attack, the trance, or one of my old fits. There sat by chance a doctor in the front row. At his feet patly I fell. My heart had stopped to beat, it seems, and several moments passed before it heaved and went on trudging to a more conclusive destination. Give me now your full attention. I can't tell you how I knew, but I did know that I had crossed the border. Everything I loved was lost, but no aorta could report regret. A sun of rubber was convulsed and set, and blood-black nothingness began to spin, a system of cells interlinked within cells, interlinked within cells, interlinked within one stem. And dreadfully distinct against the dark, a tall white fountain played. Pale Fire is a 1962 novel by Vladimir Nabokov. In the foreword to the novel, a minor academic, Charles Kinbote, has basically stolen the final work of acclaimed poet John Shade. Kinbote very briefly knew John Shade, and he has absconded to the mountains with Shade's final epic poem to write his annotation of the work. So the book is in two parts. First, the autobiographical epic poem by John Shade, and then the commentary by Charles Kinbote. There is a little bit of a wrinkle, however. Charles Kinbote thinks the book is about him. That is not even close to the strangest thing about Charles Kinbote. Throughout the text, throughout the annotations, he strongly suggests that he is the deposed king of Zenbia. Charles is a marvelous fencer and rock climber. When he was king, women threw themselves at him. Children whooped in the streets, and his tax code was admired as a thing of beauty. It's a lot. So it's unclear how much of Kinbote's account of what happened actually happened. There are things that make more sense if they did happen. I choose to believe that Kinbote actually was friends briefly with John Shade before he died, and the reason for that is it's easier for him to get a hold of the manuscript that he's annotating if they were actually friends. Despite Kinbote's extensive annotations claiming otherwise, the poem is not about him. It is an autobiography of the author from his early life, having been orphaned, to his marriage, to the suicide of his daughter, and then to his late life, and to a near-death experience he had when he had a heart attack. That's what I read from, by the way. John is a committed materialist and not religious at all, so it kind of rattles him that he saw something at all. But what really, really gets him is one day he reads in the newspaper that a woman who nearly died saw the same thing he did, a fountain. So he's a famous poet. He has enough pull with an editor of a newspaper to seek this woman out, get her contact information. And when he shows up on her doorstep, she's like, oh my gosh, a famous author. And he is not into it. He is completely disenchanted. And he wants to hear about her near-death experience, but he doesn't want her to tell him what he wants to hear, right? Like, he just wants to know what she saw. And he just can't get it. She's too much of a ditz. So he goes back to the editor and hopes that the editor has the reporter's original notes. So that way maybe he can get something that wasn't in the newspaper. Some important detail, something to illuminate what it is she saw, what they had in common, what lies beyond death. And the editor says, we printed everything we had. Just one minor thing was maybe off from the article as compared to the notes. And he's like, what is it? What's the difference? Instead of a fountain, she saw a mountain. But the interesting thing is, John, instead of feeling despair, actually kind of feels hope. And then it occurred to me, I didn't know what it was that John was looking for in the first place. The text doesn't make it super clear. I assumed that he wanted to see his daughter after his own death. But maybe that's not what he wanted. You know, he had been an atheist all of his life since his parents died at a young age. Maybe he wanted to have affirmed for him that there was nothing. Or maybe the fact that she saw a mountain and not a fountain meant that there was just enough ambiguity to assume that maybe there was something, even if the proof wasn't definitive. This entire episode is the novel in microcosm. John Shade believes he has shared this experience with another person, and when he goes to investigate, there's a transcription error. Meanwhile, in the footnotes of the poem where this is being told, Kinbote is doing a valiant job of trying to convince us these are all veiled allusions to his personal reign as king. The novel was published in 1962, which is about 5 years before Barth put out his paper Death of the Author. However, there were other precursors to Death of the Author, which basically argued the same thing. Nabokov does not merely politely disagree with Death of the Author. Nabokov constructs a reader in Kinbote, and Kinbote is ridiculous. He is a narcissist. He's a fabulist. He is a pederast. He is suicidal. He is everything John Shade isn't. Kinbote, the reader stand-in, sucks and has no significance at all outside of Shade. That's where the title of the book comes from. The moon's an errant thief, and her pale fire she steals from the sun. That's what Nabokov thinks of us. John Shade knows he is very close to death. He's had heart attacks before. His kid is dead. He knows that his parents died young. His entire poem is colored with the knowledge of his own impending death. And as I said before, one of the last things people do developmentally through their lives is they start thinking about what they're going to leave behind. So John Shade, who has no children at this point, only has his work. That has to be the answer to what am I, a poet, going to leave behind? So it's this extra special violation that this poem has been stolen by Kinbote and twisted into this narcissist's fantasy about himself. Because the reader stand-in is Kinbote, because the act of interpreting a text is treated as a violation, not an act of self-creation or transcendence, Nabokov kind of calls into question whether it's even possible to build something that outlasts us. Pale Fire is a truly brutal takedown of Death of the Author, while at the same time leaving a lot up to the interpretation of the reader. For instance, is Kinbote his real name? Did he kill John Shade, or was it an assassin like he claims? Did John Shade even exist? I don't know. But there's yet another layer of uncertainty on top of that because of the structure of the book. Pale Fire is written as a foreword, a poem, and then footnotes. And you can read it basically in any order and it makes sense. You can read the poem and then refer to the footnotes, which refer to other footnotes, or you can just read the foreword and then the poem and then the footnotes all the way through, and it makes the same amount of sense. So, because this is a nonlinear book, you can pick it up and end with Kinbote and his descent into despair, madness, and suicide. Or you can end it with Shade and his final masterwork, this final self-creative gift to the world. Whichever text appears to be deconstructing which isn't so much a reader choice, because again, this is non-linear. How you end up reading it is almost entirely an accident of where you start and which footnotes you choose to follow, etc. and so forth. And because it's non-linear, the clues to which interpretation Nabokov himself favors are pretty well hidden. So the text is like almost capricious. Like, yeah, you can read a version of it that supports a more hopeful interpretation. But if you did, it was almost entirely by chance. We've only gotten through half of Blade Runner 2049. Let's correct that now. After Deckard is kidnapped, Jo meets another of the renegade replicants who hid the child. She's now building an army of the new model replicants. Apparently, they're more capable of rebelling than anyone thinks. The rebel leader refers to the child as she. The child was a girl.
We all wish it was us. That's why we believe.
This heavily implies they all had the memory of the toy with the birthday on it, and that this is a major contributor to their rebellion. They ask Jo to go kill the captured Deckard, Deckard left his child to protect her, but he knows just enough information to lead the Wallace Corporation to her location. The rebellion sees the child as a messiah-like figure whose birth implies a continued existence that doesn't depend on humanity. A hope for the future beyond their roles as manufactured beings and slaves. When the time is right, the rebellion will reveal the child and she'll lead them to freedom. To the Resistance, their shared memory is very similar to Shades from Pale Fire. The shared memory is, or contains, evidence of their capacity to ascend. But Joe doesn't take it that way. He's not looking to rebel, at least not against a system of oppression. He wasn't looking to be part of a collective cause. Joe, from the beginning, was looking for who he was. In the beginning, the first replicant he hunted down offers him some garlic, which he doesn't recognize the smell of. The farmer used it in his food. It was a small pleasure for him, for himself, something beyond the basic requirements of survival. Joe had something similar, joy, and she was killed. Very close to the end of the movie, Joe misses Joy and seeks out a giant interactive advertisement of her. Joy is a product that can be bought. She's impossibly large and black-eyed and dehumanized through her nudity. Her turns of phrase echo how his Joy spoke to him.
You look like a good Joe.
He doesn't even own his own name. This and a few other scenes call into question how sentient Joy, the only person who ever loved Joe, really was. Joe doesn't do what the rebellion wants him to do and kill Deckard. Instead, he rescues Deckard and does something I suspect is very dangerous for the budding rebellion. He takes Deckard to meet his daughter. It's the only person it could be, the subcontractor who wrote memories for replicants. And then, having been seriously injured in the fight to save Deckard, Joe lays down in the snow and dies. Noir was a genre that came out of the post-war period. It's filled with detectives who returned from liberating concentration camps, husks of their former selves. It's about betrayal, sexual confusion, corrupt systems, and truths man would rather not know. For instance, in the 1974 noir Chinatown, the motive of the bad guy is simply to leave his mark on the world, even if that mark is simply ensuring the suffering of the next generation. And the protagonists, beyond trying to solve the mystery, want to break free of the systems and abuses that have trapped them and made them who they are. They must transcend themselves or slide into despair.
Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown.
And of course, in the first Blade Runner, Roy Beatty is aware he is about to die, unrelated to his fight to the death with Deckard. His model of replicant has a may-fly short lifespan. And so, rather than kill Deckard, he saves him. That's when he gives his famous speech. There is a tension here between what Roy says and what he's done. Everything he's seen, everything he is, will shortly be gone, but he saved a witness to tell about it. There is life after death, even if he's not the one who lives it. He wants to leave something behind. The entire film, there is this open question about the personhood of replicants, and this is the film's final verdict. The Blade Runner universe's core conflict is transcendence versus despair. Humanity has moved on to the stars, leaving the poorest and most vulnerable to scrape by on a dying Earth. Replicants, the lowest of the underclass, are called more human than human. That's an advertising slogan, boasting their utility as disposable, consumable bodies. Blade Runner isn't about humanity per se. It's about the ideas that drive this underclass. There are very few named characters in the cast of either movie who aren't replicants. In 2049, the Replicant Rebellion talks about the child in quasi-messianic terms. They call her a miracle. Ascension to them is their shared connection through memory to this reproductive female, reminiscent to bees in a hive. For Deckard, Ascension is having had a child, the very human act of having been a parent and sacrificing to keep that child alive. The very flat Jared Leto villain, the CEO of the Wallace Corporation, is a crude mirror image of Deckard. Deckard is this earthy, loving father figure, whereas Leto's villain speaks in biblical references and metaphors. His speech, his mechanical body augmentation, and his sadism mark him out as positively alien. He envisions himself as perhaps a literal father of a race of slaves who could colonize and conquer countless worlds. We don't find out if the replicants achieve liberation. Blade Runner 2049 is Joe's journey. It slowly builds him up from a machine into a man and then, devastatingly, dismantles him again. In a way, it feels almost like Joe wasn't made for this world. He searches for roots and an identity, and they slip through his fingers. But Joe knew what it was like to be an orphan, and even though those weren't his memories, even though he never could have the healing experience of really meeting his own father, in fact, he had no father, he gave that experience to someone else. Joe decided that was who he was, and then he died. So if the core conflict of the movie is despair versus ascension, did Joe despair here? I don't think he did. Joe, once a remorseless, obedient killing machine, ended the movie on his own terms. He saved Deckard and brought him to meet his daughter when it would have been much easier and safer to kill Deckard. He dies gifting this reunion between an orphan and the father who lost her. And there's no hope of any personal benefit on his part. He just has faith there's life after his own death, even if that life isn't his. And you know what? Maybe I'm being overly optimistic. Perhaps Nabokov's right, and this reader is unable to see beyond her own nose. Still, I don't think my way of looking at it is so bad. Right?